at my own company's 25th anniversary dinner. In front of 200 clients, staff, and investors I'd spent 25 years building relationships with, my son grabbed my arm, pulled me away from the microphone, and said, close enough that I could feel the heat of the words, "Get lost, old man. You're just a useless obstacle." Then he straightened his jacket and smiled at the room like nothing had happened. I stood there for 3 seconds. I looked at the room I had filled in a building I owned at a party celebrating a company whose name was mine. And then I turned and I walked to my table and I sat down and I picked up my glass. Because there are things you say in a moment like that and things you don't. And the only thing I knew with absolute certainty was that I was not going to make a scene at my own party. What happened in the 90 days after that evening is the story I want to tell you. My name is Frank Henley. I'm 57 years old. I founded Henley Climate Solutions 28 years ago with one used service van and a commercial HVAC license I'd studied for while my wife Sandra was pregnant with our first child. We started with residential maintenance calls and grew into commercial installation. And over 28 years, we became the firm that half the office buildings and hospitals and schools in this region trust with their climate control systems. 220 employees, 11 service vehicles, a reputation that took longer to build than anything money could have bought. I tell you about the business first because the business is everything that comes next. My son Marcus thought the business was his. He thought that for 5 years, since I'd stepped back from day-to-day operations and put him in the CEO chair. In those 5 years, he'd done a decent enough job. Revenue grew, staff liked him, clients mostly stayed. He was good. Not great, but good. Sharp on the finance side, reasonable with people, able to give a speech that made a room feel like things were headed somewhere. But there's a kind of competence that is really a performance of competence, and a kind of confidence that is really an inheritance of someone else's earned trust. And over 5 years, I had watched Marcus slide slowly from one end to the other. He had stopped giving credit for where things came from. He had started using I in places where the honest word was we or he or 30 years ago. And I had watched it happen and told myself it was natural. A new CEO needs to establish his own voice, needs to build his own authority. What I understand now is that I was being patient with something that wasn't growing pains. It was a character taking permanent shape, and I let the shape set too long before I looked at it clearly. That was my mistake, not stepping back, letting him forget who built the floor he was standing on. Before I tell you what I did in the 90 days after that anniversary dinner, do me one small kindness. If you've ever spent your whole life building something and then been treated like an obstacle inside it, tap subscribe. It's free, and it tells me this story found the right person. And stay to the end, because I'm going to ask you something I still argue about with myself, and I want to hear how you'd have played it. Let me tell you about the dinner first, because the dinner is where it starts. The 25th anniversary was Marcus's idea, which I should have paid more attention to. He planned the whole evening, the venue, the guest list, the program, the speakers, the awards. He asked me, about 3 weeks out, if I wanted to say a few words. I said yes, of course. It's our 25th anniversary. I like to say something, thank the clients who've been with us for 15 and 20 years. He said he'd work it into the program. I assumed it meant he would. I don't make assumptions like that anymore. The evening arrived. 300 people in a ballroom I'd rented through the building management company I'd set up years ago. Our biggest clients in the front rows, staff at the round tables, a stage with a podium and the Henley logo on a banner behind it. Marcus opened with remarks, introduced the staff awards, spoke about vision and growth and what we were going to become. He used the word I so many times I lost count after 30. He did not once mention who'd started the company, who'd done the first maintenance calls out of the back of a used van, who'd spent 12 years eating the hard years so that the good years could arrive. I was seated at a table near the back, not on the stage, not on the program, a guest at my own company's anniversary dinner. When the evening began to wind down and Marcus moved toward his closing remarks, I got up and walked toward the microphone, just to say thank you. 30 seconds, one thank you to the long-tenured clients, one to the staff who'd been with us since the beginning. That was all I wanted. Marcus got there first. He stepped between me and the podium with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd planned for exactly this moment, and his hand closed around my arm. Not a guide, not a redirect, a grip, and his mouth was close enough to my ear that the words carried clearly to the front tables and nowhere further. Get lost, old man. You're just a useless obstacle. Then he released my arm, turned back to the room, said, on behalf of the entire Henley team, thank you all for being here. And 200 people who had no idea what had just passed between us applauded. I saw a few faces near the front that had caught it, saw the split second of frozen discomfort, the polite look away. One client I'd known for 15 years caught my eye across the room and then looked at his shoes. I walked back to my table. I sat down. I picked up my glass, and I did not put it down for a while. 3 things happened in the next 30 seconds. The first was the specific pain of public humiliation, and I want to be accurate about this because it matters. Public humiliation is different from private humiliation the way a burn is different from a cut. It's the exposure as much as the wound. The people who saw it, who looked away, who will remember it the next time they interact with my son at a Henley function. That's the part that lingers. The second thing was a cold and clarifying anger, not hot, not volatile, just cold and heavy and perfectly focused, the kind that doesn't demand to express itself immediately because it already knows what it's going to do. And the third thing, the one I'm least proud of and most honest about, was relief. The strange, clean relief of a question I'd been putting off for 2 years finally answering itself without any effort on my part. I had been wondering quietly for those 2 years whether Marcus was the man I wanted my company to become, whether the direction he was taking it matched what I had built it for, whether I needed to step back in, say something, do something, or wait. And in 10 words, at a microphone, in front of the 200 people I'd spent a career earning, he answered every one of those questions for me. If you're still with me, do me that kindness and tap subscribe before I tell you what I did next. Because the next 90 days are the part that matters. I drove home alone that night. Sandra had been at the dinner. Sandra sees everything, always has 32 years of marriage, and she stayed to thank people because one of us had to, and she drove home separately. She called me on the drive. I told her I was fine. She asked, "What are you going to do?" I said I was going to sleep on it. She said, "Okay." She knows the difference between "I don't know" and "I already know and I'm not ready to say it out loud." She knew which one I was carrying. Sleep didn't come. I lay in the dark and I went through the night in my head, beat by beat, the way you go through a service call afterward when something went wrong and you need to understand exactly where it started. 5 years of Marcus running things. I went through them carefully. The things I'd noticed and filed and told myself were the growing pains of a young executive finding his footing. The times he'd introduced himself to clients without mentioning my name, which I'd read as him building his own identity, his own authority, which is what a new CEO should do. The meetings I'd slowly stopped being invited to, which I'd read as appropriate delegation, as him not wanting to burden the founder with operational noise. The gradual shift in company communications where Frank Henley's company became the Henley team, and then just Henley, and my name began to disappear from the thing I'd named after myself, which I'd read as brand modernization, as the kind of evolution that keeps a company feeling current. Lying in the dark, I read all of it differently. What I had been reading as evolution, I now understood as a deliberate and systematic erasure. Marcus had not been building his own identity alongside mine. He had been replacing mine with his. The story of where Henley Climate Solutions came from had been quietly rewritten, one meeting and one introduction and one communication at a time, until the current version of the company's narrative had almost no Frank Henley in it. He had been editing the founder out of the founding, and I had let him. That's the part one sat with longest, lying there. I had let him because I was tired of fighting for credit I didn't need, because I'm a man who built things and moved on to the next thing, because I had told myself for 5 years that the company's success was more important than my name on it. All of those things were true, and they had also made it very easy for my son to erase me from story I'd written. I thought about Carl Bergman. Carl is the president of a regional hospital network that accounts for roughly 30% of our commercial revenue. I have known Carl for 19 years. We met at a trade association dinner when neither of us had much, when he was a department head and I was the man with one van. We'd built alongside each other. Our business relationship ran on personal trust built before either of us had a reason to give it. When Carl's network needed climate work, they called Henley, and by Henley they meant me, specifically because Carl and I had shaken hands on things before there was a contract to enforce, and we had both shown up every time. In 5 years of Marcus running the company, Carl and Marcus had had almost no meaningful interaction. The 30% wasn't attached to the company. It was attached to me. If I left without a proper transition, Carl would start evaluating his options within a quarter. He was too sophisticated a buyer not to. And then I thought about the ownership structure, which is where the night stopped being about the dinner and became about something larger. Here is what Marcus knew. He was CEO with a 25% stake I transferred to him 4 years ago as a performance bonus, and he ran the company day to day. He knew this with the easy confidence of a man who has never had reason to verify what he already assumed was true. Here is what Marcus had apparently never bothered to check. I owned the other 75%. Every share. I had never transferred it, never sold it, never restructured it. We had discussed, roughly 2 years prior, a plan that would have given him a majority position. One meeting with lawyers, one round of documents, and then Marcus had gotten pulled into an expansion project, and the conversation had simply died without a follow-up being scheduled. The restructuring had never happened. The company he was treating as his own was 3/4 mine. The building the anniversary dinner had been held and was owned by a holding company I controlled entirely. The primary client relationship, sustaining nearly 1/3 of the revenue, was a personal relationship that ran through me and no one else. He'd call me a useless obstacle. He had done in my building and my party in front of clients whose relationship was with me, while holding a 25% stake in a company I still owned by a supermajority. He had never checked. In 5 years of running the company, he had never once looked at the ownership documents and confirmed what he was actually standing on. I spent 30 years in HVAC work, and the core of that work is diagnosis. You walk into a system, you follow it from component to component. You don't stop until you find exactly where the failure is. You don't guess. You check. Marcus had run my company for 5 years without once checking the structural foundation underneath it. I was going to check it for him. I pulled 5 years of board minutes, client correspondence, contract renewals, and financial summaries with Patricia Moss, my corporate attorney of 18 years. We went through them the way I'd go through a troubled system. Methodically, no assumptions, follow each wire until it terminates. What I found, read carefully and honestly, was a company that had grown modestly, but had also accumulated problems that Marcus had managed downward rather than upward. 2 major clients had come up for renewal in the last 18 months and declined to renew. Their termination letters used specific language. Changes in service quality and relationship consistency. Translated from corporate. We used to deal with Frank. Now we deal with someone who doesn't know our history, and we don't feel valued the same way. Marcus had lost them and had not told me. Had not flagged it as a warning. Had not asked what had changed, had not reached out to me to ask if I could help. He had absorbed the losses quietly and move forward, which is one kind of management decision, and it was the wrong one. I found an expansion initiative, 3 new vehicles, new staff, a push into an adjacent market segment we'd never served, that had significantly underperformed and sat as a quiet loss on the books that had never come up in any communication with me. Marcus had committed capital, the initiative had not worked, and he had chosen not to surface it, not to protect me from worry. I understood that clearly enough, but because surfacing it would have meant admitting to the founder that a major decision he'd made unilaterally hadn't panned out. And I found Dave. Dave Kimura had been with me for 19 years, one of the finest diagnostic technicians I'd ever worked with, the kind of man who could walk into a mechanical room and hear something wrong before he could see it. Dave had resigned 6 months ago. I had not been told. I found out going through personnel records. I called him, and we had lunch, and he told me the culture had changed. Said the new management wanted fast override. Said Marcus had told him in a meeting to stop worrying about perfect and start worrying about profitable. Dave had started job searching the following week. He left within 2 months, and he took 3 junior technicians with him, men he'd trained, men who trusted his judgment over any title. A competitor gained a 19-year institutional knowledge base. I gained a personnel file that said voluntary separation with no further comment. The company Marcus thought was flourishing was showing the slow, invisible signatures of a system in early degradation. Not dramatic, not yet visible in the revenue line. But I know what early failure looks like. I've diagnosed it 100 times in buildings where nobody noticed anything was wrong until a Wednesday in August when the system stopped entirely. It never comes out of nowhere. Someone just stopped checking. On the 4th day after the anniversary, I made a call I'd been circling for about 2 years. Not because of the dinner. I want to be clear about that. The dinner was not the origin of the decision. It was the end of my uncertainty about it. I called Robert Kwame, acquisitions director for a regional facilities services group that had expressed serious interest in Henley Climate on 2 previous occasions. Robert and I had had exploratory lunches. I hadn't been ready. On the 4th day after Marcus grabbed my arm in front of 200 people and called me a useless obstacle in my own building, I was ready. Patricia set up the framework. The acquisition team came in during weeks 3 and 4. They assessed thoroughly, not just the financials, but the operational depth, the client relationships, the staff tenure, the contracts. When they came back with their offer, the deal structure was specific in ways that mattered. They were acquiring the company, its contracts, its operational staff, and its IP. They were not acquiring the current CEO in a continuing management role. They were very specifically interested in an 18-month consulting agreement with the founder, with me, for client relationship management during integration. Carl Bergman's hospital network had been flagged as a relationship requiring hands-on transition management. They wanted me. They did not want Marcus. I want to sit with that for a moment because it is the precise answer to the thing Marcus said at the microphone. The company's single most valuable external relationship, 30% of revenue, 19 years of trust, was not attached to the company. It was attached to me. The useless obstacle was the one the acquirer was paying specifically to retain. The CEO who'd been performing the company for 5 years was the one they were letting go. Marcus's 25% stake paid him real money. I want to be precise about that. I did not arrange this transaction to diminish him financially. He received a significant sum, fairly structured. What he lost was not the money. What he lost was the CEO chair, the office, the title, the team, the platform, and the future he'd been performing toward for 5 years. The acquiring company's integration plan did not include a role for him. They offered a 30-day transition consulting period, which he declined. Patricia told me afterward that when Marcus received the acquisition terms, He'd been very quiet. And then he had asked one question. Did he plan this before or after the anniversary? The honest answer: the direction was set before. The timing was after. The anniversary didn't create the decision. It just closed the last door I'd been keeping open, the one I'd been holding ajar out of loyalty to the history between us. The history between us didn't survive him grabbing my arm in front of my clients and telling me to get lost. That was the weight that closed the door. I signed the acquisition agreement on a Wednesday morning in February, 91 days after my son told me to get lost at my own company's anniversary dinner. I want to tell you what that moment felt like, because people expect it to feel like victory, and it didn't. I sat at Patricia's conference table, and I read through the final documents the way I've read every document of consequence in my adult life. Slowly, from the beginning, every page, and when I signed, I felt the specific weight of a thing becoming permanent. Not regret, not relief, just the irreversibility of a line crossed. 28 years of building had just become 28 years of having built. That's a different tense, and it changes everything that comes after. Sandra and I went to dinner that evening. Same restaurant we'd gone to the night I got my contractor's license 28 years ago, the night Henley Climate Solutions became legally real. She remembered what we'd ordered then, which I hadn't, and when she told me, I laughed for the first time since the anniversary. We stayed until the restaurant was nearly empty, and we talked mostly about the early years, the years before any of this existed, when it was one van and a prayer and a woman who believed in both. At the end of the night, she said, walking to the car, "He's still your son." "I know," I said. "That doesn't fix itself on a timeline." "No," I said. "It doesn't." She was right. It doesn't. Marcus and I have spoken once since the closing. A phone call, civil but not warm, the particular civility of two people who have a great deal unsaid between them and have both decided, for now, not to say it. He didn't apologize. I didn't demand one. We are not where we need to be. Whether we get there, I genuinely don't know. He's my son. That's not a fact that changes based on what a person does. But some things have to be earned back, and that takes time, and what it takes after that I can't tell you from where I'm standing. What I wasn't prepared for was the grief of the sale itself. I had expected the anger to be the hard part. The anger came and went cleanly. It had a shape and a cause, and it resolved into the decision, and the decision carried it forward. The grief was something else. Slower, less shaped. The kind that settles in after the decision is made and done and can't be reconsidered and stays. 28 years. One van in a rented garage. The first client who trusted me before I'd given them a reason. A restaurant owner at 2 in the morning in January. His refrigeration unit down, standing over my shoulder while I worked because he needed it back before the morning delivery. I got it running. He shook my hand and paid me cash and told me to call him when I had a card made up. That handshake at 2 in the morning was where Henley Climate Solutions actually started. Not the license, not the filing. A stranger deciding to trust me. The first year end, when we actually turned a real profit, and I called Sandra from the parking lot, and she cried. The morning I hired our 50th employee and stood outside the building for 10 minutes not going in because I wanted to hold the moment before it became the past. All of that was what I built. And here is what I did not sell, what was never in the acquisition documents, what no term sheet in any transaction I have ever seen could capture. The first maintenance call. The handshake. Sandra calling from the parking lot when the first profit check cleared. The 50th employee. The clients who called my personal cell, because the relationship was between people, not entities. Those things are mine permanently. They travel with the man, not with the company. Marcus could not take them by being CEO, and the acquirer could not buy them by writing a check. They are what 28 years actually produces if you do it right. And they are exactly what a son who grabs his father's arm and calls him a useless obstacle does not understand he's looking at. All of that was what I built, What I sold was the infrastructure. The infrastructure was worth a great deal of money. The thing underneath, it was worth more. And it stayed with me. Even when the decision was right, and it was right, I would make it again tomorrow without hesitation. There's a specific and permanent weight to handing the keys to something you built from nothing. Every time I drive past a Henley service vehicle now, on a road somewhere with someone else's name on the registration, I feel it. Not regret, just the past tense. The particular heaviness of something becoming history. I spent 30 years in HVAC, and I'll leave you with the truest thing that work ever taught me. In any climate system, the most important component is the one nobody thinks about. Not the big equipment, not the compressors and the air handlers and the cooling towers that everybody sees when they walk into a mechanical room. The gaskets, the seals, the small components that hold the pressure in and keep the system running the way it's supposed to run. When a gasket fails, the whole system fails. But while it's working, while it's doing exactly the job it was made to do, nobody knows it's there. That's the point. You do the work so well and so invisibly that the people inside the building never have to think about the air. The comfort is the evidence of your competence. The invisibility is the success. I spent 28 years being the gasket in my own company, the thing that held the pressure in, the client relationships, the ownership structure, the reputation that preceded every sales call, the institutional knowledge that Dave Kimura carried and that walked out the door with him and couldn't be replaced by a job listing. All of it invisible, all of it structural, all of it the reason the system ran. And I made the mistake of thinking that invisible meant absent. That because I wasn't in the daily meetings, I wasn't in the foundation. And Marcus made the same mistake. He looked at the running system and decided it ran because of him, because he was the part he could see, because the compressor is large and loud, and the gasket is small and silent, and people see what is large and loud. He stopped noticing what was holding the pressure in, and then he grabbed my arm and told me to get lost. Here's what a gasket can do that a compressor can't. It can decide to leave. A machine has no choice about whether it holds. A man does. And when a man who's been holding the pressure in for 28 years decides he's held it long enough, he doesn't fail. He walks. He removes himself from the system on his own terms, quietly, without drama, and he lets the people who thought he was an obstacle find out exactly what he was holding together. He called me a useless obstacle. In 30 years of systems work, I never once met a gasket that was useless. I met a lot of engineers who didn't know what they were looking at. There's a moment in every diagnostic where you find the failure and you understand, in retrospect, that it was always going to fail, that the conditions that produced the failure were present from the beginning, and that all the time the system was running smoothly, it was running toward that moment. I don't know if that's true of Marcus. I don't know if what happened at the microphone was always going to happen, or if something could have gone differently. I've thought about it a great deal. What I know is that I had 28 years, and I used them, and what I built is real, and what comes next, for me, and in time, I hope for us, is still being written. So here's my question, and I want your honest answer down in the comments. I moved quietly. I didn't confront Marcus after the dinner. I didn't give him the chance to apologize or explain or recognize what he'd done before I acted. I went to my attorney, I went to the acquirer, and I moved. And Marcus found out what he'd lost from a term sheet, not from his father. Some part of me wonders, did I owe him a conversation first? Should I have sat across from him and said, here's what you did, here's what it means, here's what you need to understand before I acted? Or does a man who grabs his father's arm in front of 200 people and tells him to get lost forfeit the right to a private warning? I made my choice. I stand by it. But I still turn the question over. Tell me how you see it. If this story meant something to you, do me that kindness, subscribe, hit like, and remember, before you dismiss the quiet person in the room who doesn't fight for the spotlight, the one whose name has been quietly disappearing from the story, The one who shows up and doesn't make it about themselves. Check what they're holding together. Check whose name is on the building. It's almost never nothing. And the man holding it together is almost never the one you thought was an obstacle. I'll see you next time. And if you've got someone in your life whose name has been disappearing from their own story, tell them you see them. Tell them before they decide they've held the pressure in long enough. A note before you go. This story is a work of fiction written and dramatized for entertainment. The names, characters, and events are invented, and any resemblance to real people or events is purely coincidental. But if its lesson stayed with you, that the people who build invisibly are the ones whose